The sun was sinking low over the Wyoming plains, bleeding gold and crimson across an endless sky when Luke Carver spotted her, a lone woman standing beside a broken wagon at the edge of his land. Dust rose in pale ghosts around her skirts, the kind of dust that carried stories of people who'd come too far and lost too much. Luke slowed his horse, suspicion and pity wrestling quietly in his chest. The woman looked worn from travel, her bonnet limp, her face pale but proud. In her hands she clutched a letter like it was the last thing tethering her to the world. He'd seen settlers before, men chasing gold, families chasing God. But there was something different about her. She stood straight despite the wind, like she refused to let the prairie break her. When he drew closer, he noticed the trembling of her fingers, the way she tried to hide it by folding her hands tight in front of her. "You lost, ma'am?" Luke asked, tipping his hat, his voice rough from days of silence. Her eyes lifted to his in gray-blue, stormy and guarded. "Not lost," she answered softly, "just left." That word hit him harder than a kick from his old Mustang. Left. Out here that could mean a death sentence. Luke dismounted, boots crunching over dry grass. He didn't want trouble, but he wasn't the kind of man to leave someone stranded either. "Name's Luke Carver," he said. "You're standing on my land. You got somewhere you're headed?" She hesitated, biting her lip before handing him the letter. The paper was creased, words blurred by what looked like tears. "I was supposed to meet a man," she said. "A Mr. Turner. He sent for me from Kansas. We were to be married." Luke's jaw tightened. "Mail-order bride," he muttered under his breath. He'd heard plenty about such arrangements. Some ended in happiness, others in heartbreak. "And where's this Mr. Turner?" Her gaze drifted to the empty horizon. "Gone. The man who drove the stagecoach said he packed up last week. No explanation." Her voice cracked then just a little, like a branch snapping in the cold. "I sold everything I had to come here." She blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. Luke felt something shift inside him, something quiet and old. He'd known loss, too. He'd buried a wife years ago, a fever taking her before spring could bring her flowers. Since then, he'd lived like a ghost, working his ranch, keeping to himself, not daring to let kindness stay too long. But looking at this woman, stranded, proud, and broken all at once, he couldn't ride away. "You can't stay out here," he said. "There's wolves in the hills and worse things in the dark. My cabin's half a mile east. You can rest there till you figure what comes next." Her eyes widened a little. "I couldn't impose." "Wasn't asking permission," he interrupted gently, the corner of his mouth tugging in something like a smile. "Just offering shelter." The woman hesitated before nodding. He noticed her name written in careful ink on the letter. Clara Bennett. It fit her somehow, soft but strong. As they rode toward the cabin, dusk folded around them like a tired blanket. The prairie was alive with night sounds. Coyotes calling, crickets singing. The wind brushing through the tall grass like a sigh. Luke glanced at her now and then, noting how she sat straight in the saddle even though she clearly wasn't used to riding. Her hands trembled, her dress dusty, but her chin stayed high. She had a quiet courage that stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. When they reached his cabin, the sky had turned violet. Smoke still lingered from the fire he'd left burning that morning. It wasn't much, just rough timber walls, a porch, and a barn behind. But it was warm and honest, like the man who built it. He helped her down, and when she stumbled slightly, he caught her arm, his hand strong and calloused against her sleeve. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, his dark and unreadable, hers shining with exhaustion and a trace of trust. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't even know me." Luke gave a small shrug. "World's hard enough, Miss Bennett. No need to make it harder." Inside, he lit a lamp, its glow chasing the shadows from the corners. She looked around, the worn quilt on the bed, the book stacked on a shelf, the rifle above the door. It was a man's home, lonely but cared for. "You can take the bed," Luke said, pouring water into a basin. "I'll sleep out by the fire." Clara shook her head quickly. "No, I'll take the floor." He raised an eyebrow, that half-smile returning. "You're my guest, ma'am. I insist." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers tied together by fate and bad timing. Then she nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you as she set her things down. Luke turned toward the fire, pretending not to notice how the lamplight caught her hair as she took off her bonnet, revealing soft waves the color of autumn wheat. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin walls. Inside, silence settled like snow. Luke sat near the fire, staring into the flames, thinking about the woman sleeping under his roof. He told himself it was just temporary. He'd help her get to town, find her a place to stay, maybe some work. But deep down, something restless had already begun to stir, a feeling he thought had died long ago. And somewhere behind him, in the dim light, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, she didn't feel entirely alone. Morning came with a pale wash of light spilling through the cabin window, touching the dust motes that danced like golden snow. Luke rose early, as he always did, the habits of ranch life etched into his bones. He tried not to make noise, but the creak of the floorboards gave him away. Clara stirred under the quilt, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling, and for a fleeting moment she didn't remember where she was. Then the scent of wood smoke and coffee reached her, and she saw Luke by the hearth pouring steaming black liquid into a tin mug. His back was straight, his shoulders broad beneath a faded shirt, and there was something quietly steady about him, like the land itself. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Good morning," she answered, her voice soft but clearer now, steadier. He set a second mug on the table. "Ain't much, but it'll warm you." "You sleep all right?" She hesitated, fingers brushing the edge of the quilt. "Yes, better than I expected. Thank you, Mr. Carver." He glanced at her then, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Luke's fine." The day stretched wide and still outside, the prairie glistening under a low sun. Luke went about his chores, checking the fence line, feeding the horses, chopping wood. And though Clara offered to help, he waved her off at first. But she was not the kind of woman who could sit idle. Within an hour, she had tidied the cabin, folded his scattered laundry, and set a pot of beans to simmer. When Luke came in at noon, sweat dampening his brow, the air smelled of onions, herbs, and something else he hadn't known he missed, the comfort of a woman's hand in a home. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a long moment. She stood by the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair escaping its pins, sunlight catching the curve of her cheek. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. She turned, smiling faintly. "I wanted to. I'm used to working, not waiting." Luke nodded slowly. "You remind me of my wife," he said before realizing the words had slipped out. Her smile faltered just a little, not in offense but in curiosity. "You were married?" He nodded once, setting his hat on the peg. "A long time ago. Fever took her before winter came. Buried her up on the hill near the cottonwood." Clara lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "Was a long while back. Life don't stop for sorrow." After lunch, she offered to help with chores outside. Luke hesitated but handed her a pair of old gloves anyway. Together, they mended a section of fence where a storm had torn it loose. The wind tugged at her skirts and she laughed, really laughed, when a stubborn goat tried to chew the hem of her dress. The sound startled Luke. It had been years since laughter had filled his land. He found himself smiling without meaning to, watching her with quiet admiration. She worked without complaint, her movements clumsy at first but determined. There was grit beneath her gentle manner, and he respected that more than he could say. Days turned into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and quiet talk. Afternoons were spent riding to the creek for water, tending the animals, or cooking together in the dim cabin light. Clara discovered that Luke wasn't as stern as he appeared. Beneath that rugged silence lived a man of deep patience and a wry sense of humor. He taught her to saddle a horse, how to split kindling, how to tell a coming storm by the color of the horizon. She, in turn, filled the cabin with small touches. Wildflowers in a tin cup, a mended curtain, a pie baked from wild berries that stained her fingers violet. Sometimes, at night when the prairie winds howled and coyotes cried from the distance, they sat by the fire and talked in murmurs. Clara spoke of her life in Kansas, her parents' farm, the years of drought, the letters that had promised her a husband and a home. Luke listened, his eyes steady on the flames, saying little but hearing everything. He told her about the ranch and how his father built it, how the land had almost beaten him more than once, how silence had been his only companion for too long. It was during one of those quiet nights, when the lamp burned low and the air smelled faintly of rain, that something shifted. Clara had fallen asleep on the chair by the fire, her head resting against her arm, soft hair spilling over her shoulder. Luke sat across from her, watching her in the half-light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. There was a peace in her face he hadn't seen before, a strength born of pain but softened by hope. Something in his chest ached, not in grief this time, but in longing. He stood, careful not to wake her, and draped a blanket over her shoulders. His hand brushed a strand of hair from her face, and for a heartbeat, the world went utterly still. Then he stepped back, his breath uneven, and turned toward the window where rain had begun to patter against the glass. The next morning, she woke early and found him outside, repairing the barn roof in the drizzle. Without a word, she pulled on her shawl and climbed the ladder beside him, holding the boards while he nailed them down. "You don't have to," he began, but she cut him off with a smile. "I want to," and that was that. They worked side by side in silence, the kind of silence that said more than words could. As the days passed, the bond between them grew like wildflowers after a storm, quietly, naturally, without either of them naming it. The loneliness that had clung to the cabin began to lift, replaced by the soft hum of shared laughter, the comfort of two voices where there once was one. And yet, beneath it all, an unspoken question lingered. What would happen when the world found her again? When the next stagecoach came through, would Clara Bennett still stay on Luke Carver's land, or would she chase the life she'd been promised before fate set her down at his door? By the time summer ripened across the plains, Luke and Clara had fallen into an easy rhythm that made the long days seem shorter. The prairie grass shimmered like gold under the sun. The cattle grazed lazily by the creek, and wild roses bloomed along the fences Clara had helped mend. She'd grown stronger, surer of herself. Her hands, once soft and unused to ranch work, now bore tiny scars and a faint sunburn that Luke found endearing. Every evening they sat together on the porch, he with his pipe, she with her mending, while the sky burned itself into sunset. There was peace between them, something fragile yet deep, though neither dared to name it. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One late afternoon, a rider appeared in the distance, a blur of dust and leather cutting across the land. Luke shaded his eyes and frowned. It was Bill Mason, the postmaster from town, talkative as a magpie and twice as nosy. Bill reined in hard by the fence, tipping his hat with that easy grin that always made Luke wary. "Afternoon, Carver. Didn't expect to find you playing house way out here." Luke stepped down from the porch, his voice calm. "What brings you here, Bill?" Bill's grin widened. "Got a letter come in. Addressed to a Miss Clara Bennett, care of Luke Carver." His eyes flicked toward the porch where Clara stood, her hands gripping her apron. "Guess that'd be you, ma'am?" Clara nodded hesitantly, descending the steps. Luke caught the quick, nervous glance she sent him before taking the letter. Bill lingered, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Whole town's been wondering about you two," he said with a chuckle. "Mail-order bride left high and dry ends up living with the quietest man in the county. You got folks talking." Luke's jaw tightened. "You've delivered the mail. Now ride on." Bill blinked, then laughed, spurring his horse. "It didn't mean offense, Luke. Just saying folks notice things. Ain't every day a lady from Kansas takes up at a bachelor's cabin." When the dust from his horse faded, Clara still stood frozen with the unopened letter in her hand. Luke watched her for a moment before speaking softly. "You don't have to read it now." She looked up at him, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "It might be from the agency, or from Mr. Turner." The name fell like a shadow between them. Inside the cabin, she broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was short, written in a hurried scrawl. As she read, her face paled. Luke stood silent by the door, waiting. Finally, she lowered the paper, voice faint. "It's from him, from Mr. Turner, he says. He says he changed his mind, that he married someone else. He says he's sorry for the inconvenience." Her voice broke then, a small sound that twisted something deep in Luke's chest. He stepped closer, but she turned away, pressing the letter to her chest. "I was such a fool," she whispered. "I believed every word he wrote. I thought I'd finally have a home." Luke spoke low and steady. "You ain't the fool here, Clara. The man who breaks his word is." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "What am I supposed to do now?" He hesitated, then said the truth as it came to him. "You already got a home." She looked up sharply, meeting his eyes that had always held strength but now carried something gentler too. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, something invisible yet powerful passed between them. like the moment before rain breaks after a long drought. That night, neither could sleep. Clara lay awake staring at the flicker of firelight across the ceiling. Luke sat outside on the porch watching lightning dance far away over the plains. The storm built slowly, rumbling like a restless beast. He thought of her inside, alone, her dreams stolen and heart bruised. He thought of his own years spent hiding from the world. Maybe fate had brought them together for a reason neither could yet name. When the first raindrops fell, heavy and cold, he came back inside. Clara sat up, startled. "The roof will hold?" she asked. "It'll hold," he said quietly. He added another log to the fire and she watched him in silence, the glow tracing the strong lines of his face. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above the rain. "You've been kind to me, Luke, kinder than anyone's ever been. I don't know how to repay you." He turned, meeting her eyes. "Don't need repaying." He hesitated, then added softly, "Just don't leave before I've gotten used to the sound of your laughter." Her breath caught. Outside, thunder rolled low. Inside, the space between them felt charged, with unspoken emotion, with longing, with something dangerously close to love. She rose slowly, walking to the window, her silhouette framed by the glow of lightning. "What will the town say?" she murmured. Luke's voice came rough but certain. "Let him talk. I stopped caring what folks think a long time ago." For a long while they stood like that, the cowboy by the fire, the woman by the window, the storm raging between them and outside them both. Then Clara turned and smiled, a small, tremulous smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe I've stopped caring too." When the storm broke fully, it shook the cabin with wind and rain. Luke crossed the room, checking the shutters, then found her again by the window. "You should rest," he said softly. She nodded, but neither of them moved. The thunder boomed again, closer this time, and instinctively she flinched. He reached out, not thinking, just doing, and his hand found hers. For a heartbeat they stayed that way, silent but steady. The storm roared through the night, but inside the small cabin, a fragile calm held. For the first time in years, Luke felt the loneliness in him quiet, replaced by something warmer, something that felt dangerously like hope. And though Clara didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer abandoned. A week after the storm, the world outside seemed scrubbed clean, the air crisp, the land glistening beneath the sun. Clara woke early, feeling lighter, freer somehow. She'd burned Mr. Turner's letter in the fire the night before, watching the flames devour each lying word until only gray ash remained. It felt like closing a door she'd been too afraid to shut. Now, as she stepped outside, the prairie stretched endless and alive before her, a horizon that no longer seemed to mock her loneliness but whisper promise. Luke was already out by the corral, mending a gate that had come loose during the storm. She walked toward him, her skirts brushing wet grass. "Morning," she called, and he looked up, smiling in that quiet way of his, not wide or showy, but deep enough to make her heart trip. "Morning, Clara, skies finally cleared." She laughed softly. "It feels different today, like the world's starting over." He nodded, eyes following the clouds drifting east. "Maybe we both are." Life settled back into its rhythm, though something between them had subtly changed. Their silences now felt warm instead of uncertain. Their glances held meaning neither dared put into words. At night she still took the bed and he the fire, but the air carried a quiet tension, an awareness that neither could ignore. Luke caught himself lingering on the sound of her voice when she hummed to herself, or the way she smiled when the wind caught her hair. Clara noticed the gentleness behind his strength, how he'd stop his work to free a trapped bird from the chicken coop, how he'd fix things before she ever asked. Love, though unspoken, had begun to grow like the prairie grass after rain. Steady, unstoppable, wild. But gossip, like wind, could travel faster than any horse. One morning a wagon approached, raising a trail of dust. Luke frowned when he saw who it was. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Alcott, perched primly on the seat, her bonnet starched and her lips pursed. Beside her sat a younger woman from town, clutching a basket of bread. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, nerves twisting in her stomach. "Mrs. Bennett," Mrs. Alcott greeted with a smile too tight to be kind. "We heard you've been staying out here alone with Mr. Carver. Such a dangerous thing for a young lady. We thought you might appreciate some company, and perhaps a ride back to town." Clara stiffened, but before she could speak, Luke appeared at her side. his presence like a wall. "She's fine where she is," he said simply. The preacher's wife raised a brow. "I'm sure she is, but tongues do wag, Mr. Carver. A gentleman and a lady living under one roof without vows, well, you can imagine how folks might see it." Luke's voice stayed calm but hard. "Let 'em imagine. They don't know us." The women exchanged glances, murmuring something about propriety and decency. Clara's cheeks burned, shame warring with anger. When they finally left, leaving behind a loaf of bread as if to cleanse their conscience, she stood silent, staring after the wagon. Luke turned to her quietly. "Don't let him get to you." Her eyes glistened. "It's not that simple." "They're right. I shouldn't still be here. You've been nothing but good to me, Luke. But I can't have your name dragged through the dirt because of me." He stepped closer, voice low but firm. "I don't give a damn about gossip." She shook her head. "But I do. You've worked hard for your place here. You deserve respect." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "Respect don't mean much if you've got no one to share it with." The words hung between them, heavy and honest. She looked up, startled, searching his face. His eyes, dark, steady, impossibly kind, held nothing but truth. For a moment she wanted to throw her arms around him, to tell him she felt the same. But fear caught her tongue. Instead she whispered, "I don't want to ruin your life." Luke gave a small smile. "You already saved it." That night, Clara sat by the fire long after he'd gone to the porch. The stars were sharp and bright through the window. She thought of the preacher's wife, of the life she'd once imagined. Clean streets, tidy dresses, polite smiles. And she thought of this life, the rough cabin, the endless sky, the man whose silence spoke more love than any vow she'd ever heard. She realized she didn't want to go back to the world that pitied her. She wanted this world, wild, honest, and full of heart. When she stepped outside, Luke was sitting on the steps, looking out over the dark prairie. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No, too many thoughts." He smiled faintly. "Me too." For a while they said nothing. Then softly Clara whispered, "If I stayed, really stayed, would that be all right?" Luke turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened into something so tender it made her breath catch. "You don't even have to ask." She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You'd want me here and after everything?" He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing her palm. "Clara, I don't reckon I've wanted much in this life. But I want you here, with me." The prairie wind swept past them, cool and sweet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as the world went quiet around them. No vows were spoken that night, no promises written on paper, only the steady beat of two hearts that had found each other against all odds. But life on the frontier had a way of testing even the truest love. As dawn crept over the horizon, bringing with it the sound of distant hoofbeats, neither of them yet knew that fate wasn't quite done with them. Someone was coming, and he carried with him the shadow of Clara's past. The morning began like any other. Pale sunlight spilling over the prairie, a slow wind bending the tall grass, the sound of roosters echoing faintly from the barn. Luke was chopping wood near the edge of the cabin yard when he heard the sound of hoofbeats, heavy, urgent, unfamiliar. He straightened, brow furrowing, as a lone rider appeared over the ridge. The man was dressed in a worn gray coat, his hat low over his eyes, a pistol hanging at his hip. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. The moment she saw the stranger, her breath caught in her throat. "Clara," the man called as he drew near, reining in sharply. "Clara Bennett?" Her hands froze on her apron. "Mr. Turner?" Luke's jaw clenched at the name. He didn't move, but every muscle in his body went taut. Turner swung down from his horse, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. "Clara," he said again, his tone oily with practiced charm. "I came back for you. I made a mistake." Clara stared at him, stunned into silence. The man she'd once believed would be her husband stood before her. But the illusion she'd loved was gone. He looked older, rougher, his face lined not by hardship but arrogance. "You made a mistake?" she repeated quietly. Turner nodded quickly. "I married in haste, and she passed not 2 months after. I realized I couldn't stop thinking about you. The agency said you'd come here. I figured I'd find you." His eyes slid toward Luke, narrowing slightly. Didn't expect you to be living with another man. Luke's voice was calm but carried steel. Watch your words, Turner, Turner sneered. And who are you to her, cowboy? Some drifter who took advantage of a desperate woman? Before Luke could reply, Clara stepped forward. Her voice was steady, her hands no longer trembling. He's the man who gave me a roof when I had none. The man who treated me with respect when you left me in the dirt. The man who never lied to me. Turner blinked, caught off guard. Clara, you don't mean to stay here out in the middle of nowhere, with him? I mean to stay exactly where I'm loved, she said firmly. Luke turned his gaze toward her, something unspoken but powerful flickering in his eyes. Turner looked between them, anger twisting his face. You'll regret this, he hissed. A woman like you don't belong out here. You were meant for a proper life. Clara drew herself up, shoulders straight, chin high. The wind tugging at her hair like the prairie itself stood behind her. A proper life? She echoed. You mean a life built on lies? You taught me what that kind of life feels like. Mr. Turner, I choose honesty now. Turner's expression hardened, but when Luke stepped closer, slow, deliberate, hand resting casually on the handle of his axe, the man flinched. You best ride on, Luke said quietly. Before I forget I'm a gentleman. Turner glared once more, then spat in the dust. You'll come crawling back someday, he muttered before swinging onto his horse. He didn't look back as he rode off toward the horizon. When the sound of hooves faded, Clara exhaled shakily, as though she'd been holding her breath for years. Luke walked toward her, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. You all right? He asked. She nodded, eyes glistening. I am now. He studied her face, searching for doubt, but found none. What he saw instead was peace. The peace of a woman who'd faced her past and chosen her future. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle as the wind. You didn't have to say all that, he murmured. I did, she said, because it's true. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every word they hadn't said yet, every feeling they'd both tried to deny. Luke took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Clara, he said slowly, I ain't a man of fancy words or fine promises. I can't give you much, just this land, this cabin, and what's left of me. But if that's enough, her fingers found his, threading through. It's more than enough. He smiled then, a real smile, wide and boyish, the kind that made the years fall from his face. Without thinking, he drew her close, and she came willingly, her hands resting against his chest as he kissed her. Soft, certain, the kind of kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The prairie wind swept around them, the grass bowing like witnesses to something sacred. By autumn, word had spread that Luke Carver had married the woman fate had once left on his doorstep. Some folks whispered, others smiled, but Luke and Clara paid no mind. They worked side by side, built the ranch stronger than before, and filled the cabin with laughter, the kind that warmed even the coldest winter nights. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop at Carver Ranch and see a woman standing on the porch at sunset, her golden hair glowing in the light, and a tall cowboy beside her, his arm around her shoulders. They'd say the two looked like they'd been carved right out of the land itself. Strong, quiet, unbreakable. And when the prairie wind carried their laughter across the wide open fields, it sounded like a promise kept, that love, once found, could weather every storm and make even the loneliest cabin feel like home.